September 1962. Somewhere in the American South. The specific geography matters less than the specific moment, because what happened in that diner on that Tuesday afternoon happened everywhere in America that year, in 1,000 diners and 1,000 towns, with 1,000 variations on the same essential cruelty. The difference was that this particular Tuesday, in this particular diner, someone was sitting at the counter who had not been there the 1,000 times before. The diner was called Mel's. Formica tables, linoleum floor in a black and white check faded by years of mopping to something approximate. Fluorescent lights that gave everything the flat, honest light of places with no interest in making themselves look better than they are. A hand-lettered sign near the register, painted there so long it had become part of the architecture. We reserved the right to refuse service. It was 11 in the morning. The breakfast rush had thinned. A few tables occupied, salesmen with briefcases, a woman in a church hat, two men in work clothes over coffee. The kind of room that had been having the same Tuesday morning for 20 years and expected to keep having it. Then the bell above the door rang twice. Two men walked in, and the room, which had been having a perfectly ordinary Tuesday, began, or slowly, then all at once, to have something else entirely. The first man through the door was Walter Hayes, 71 years old, Korean War veteran, 2 tours, Purple Heart, a knee that had never worked properly since 1951, and that he had stopped mentioning because mentioning it had never changed anything. He wore a plaid flannel shirt washed so many times the pattern had softened to something gentle, a small service cross on his collar, a veteran's pin on his chest, the kind issued to men who had gone somewhere cold and dangerous on behalf of a country that was still, in September of 1962, deciding how much of itself it was willing to extend to men who looked like him. He chose a table near the window, set his service cap on the seat beside him, put his hands around the empty space where a cup would go, if someone brought one, and looked out at the parking lot with the patience of a man who has learned to wait for things. A waitress passed his table, did not stop. Another staff member came from the kitchen, looked at the table, kept walking. What happened next had happened to Walter Hayes before, in 100 ordinary places across the American South that had a sign on the wall and a policy and practice, and a particular way of making a man understand, without ever quite saying it directly, that his presence was being tolerated rather than welcomed, and only just. The second man through the door had been in California 3 days earlier, 32 years old, dark hair, a jaw that had been useful to him professionally. Every Tuesday night for 3 years, somewhere between 40 and 60 million Americans had watched it on their television sets. He was between jobs. Rawhide had wrapped for the season, and he had come south on a trip that was partly personal and partly the restlessness that comes over certain men when they have too many consecutive days without something to do. He had stopped at Mel's because he was hungry. He sat at the counter, ordered coffee, ordered eggs, drank his coffee and looked at the room the way people look at rooms when they are not thinking about anything in particular. And then he noticed the table near the window, the man sitting there alone, the service cap on the seat beside him, the hands around the empty space where a cup should have been, the 2 staff members who had passed without stopping, the particular quality of the waiting, not impatient, not surprised, the waiting of someone who has done this before and knows how it ends and is doing it anyway. With a dignity the room was not extending to him, and that he had therefore brought entirely himself. Clint set his coffee cup down. He looked at the counter, looked at the table, looked at the sign on the wall, and made a decision that took approximately 4 seconds and that he would never, across the 60 years that followed, describe as a decision at all, because to him it wasn't one. He picked up his coffee cup, not dramatically, not with the performance of someone who wants the room to watch. He just picked it up, the simple, unhurried motion of a man relocating, stepped off the counter stool, and walked across the diner to the table by the window. The room registered this. The woman in the church hat looked up from her reading. One of the work clothes men nudged the other. The waitress looked through the service window with an expression that hadn't yet decided what it was. Clint pulled out the chair across from Walter Hayes and sat down. Walter looked at him with the careful attention of someone who has learned to read rooms quickly, Because in 1962, reading rooms quickly was a survival skill. Mind if I sit? Clint asked. Walter looked at the counter where Clint had been, then back. It's a free country, he said. The specific phrasing of a man who has thought about that sentence enough to know how complicated it is. Clint smiled, the slight, genuine smile of someone who caught the full weight of it. Mostly, he said. He set his coffee cup on the table, raised his hand for the waitress with the casual ease of someone accustomed to being seen. She came out of the kitchen, looked at the table, looked at Clint, and stopped approximately 6 feet away with the expression of someone whose Tuesday had just departed substantially from the version she had been expecting. His name was Danny. 24, third-generation Southern, had worked at Mel's since 17. He came from the back when he saw the situation developing, specifically to manage it, which meant explain the policy in terms polite enough to be deniable and clear enough to be effective. He approached the table. "Can I help you?" he said to Clint. Not to Walter, to Clint. The specific geometry of the sentence communicating the policy without stating it. "2 coffees," Clint said, "and whatever the special is." Danny looked at him, looked at Walter, back at Clint. "Sir," he said carefully, "we have certain guidelines about—" "2 coffees," Clint said again. Exactly the same tone, the specific, terrifying patience of someone who was not going to need to raise his voice. "Sir, the management has a policy regarding—" "What's your name?" Clint asked. Danny told him. "Danny." Clint looked at him the way Harry Callahan would look at people 6 years later. The same eyes, the same stillness, the same quality of a man who has asked his last question before arriving at his last answer. "Bring 2 coffees, bring the special for both of us. Then go tell your manager that a customer asked you to pass something along." Danny waited. "Tell him that every man at this table served this country. One of them served it longer than both of us have been alive. And if this diner can't extend him a cup of coffee, then this diner has a problem that has nothing to do with policy and everything to do with what it actually is." Danny did not move for a moment. The diner had gone quiet the way places go quiet when everyone has simultaneously stopped pretending to do something else. The woman in the church hat set her reading down. The 2 work-clothes men turned their chairs. The salesmen put down their forks. 31 people in a diner in the American South in September 1962, watching a young man with a familiar face tell a waiter that the policy was the problem. Danny looked at Clint. Clint looked back. The fluorescent light above the table hummed once, the specific sound of electrical indifference to human drama. Then Danny went to the kitchen. Walter Hayes looked at Clint across the table. The careful, quiet look of a man who has spent 71 years learning not to expect this, and is now sitting with the evidence that the world occasionally surprises you. "You know what you just did," Walter said. Not a question. "Had breakfast," Clint said. Walter smiled, the smile that the photograph would capture. Warm, direct, slightly overwhelmed. The smile of a man receiving something simple that should not have required any of the courage it just required to deliver. Looking at Clint the way people look at someone who has done something decent in a room organized around indecency. "They know who you are," Walter said quietly. "Some of them. From the television." "Good," Clint said. "Then they know I'm staying." 2 coffee cups arrived, set down by Danny, who did not make eye contact with either man, and who went back to the kitchen and did not return to that table for the rest of the meal. They talked for 40 minutes. Walter Hayes had grown up in Georgia, enlisted in 1942, came home from 2 wars to a country that had put its gratitude in paperwork and its policy in signs on diner walls, had built a life in the space the country extended to him. A wife, 3 children, a garden, a dog, and the third Tuesday, appointments that never produced anything except the particular exhaustion of bureaucracy. He attended them anyway, because attending was what you did. Clint listened the way people who are genuinely listening listen, without the performance of it, without the impatient energy of someone composing their next sentence while the other person is still talking. He asked questions, not the questions of someone demonstrating sympathy, the questions of someone who wanted to know. Around them, the diner resumed its Tuesday, not entirely, but in the cautious way that rooms resume themselves after something has happened that the walls will remember longer than the people. The woman in the church hat, before she left, stopped at the table. She said to Walter, "Thank you for your service." Walter looked at her with the careful look of a man deciding whether this is genuine. He decided it was. "Thank you for saying so," he said. The door closed behind her. The bell rang once. Clint watched her go, then looked back at Walter. "How long since someone said that to you?" Walter was quiet for a moment. "Long enough that I'd stopped counting." The manager came out at 11:30. His name was Reg, mid-50s. He had been watching from the back since Danny reported the situation, spending 20 minutes deciding what to do about it and not arriving at a comfortable answer. He approached the table, looked at Clint, then Walter, then Clint again. "I need to speak with you," he said to Clint. "Go ahead." Reg glanced at Walter, the glance communicating without words that the conversation was not intended to include him. "Speak," Clint said. "He's with me." Reg cleared his throat. "We have a policy." "I've heard about the policy," Clint said. He gestured toward the sign on the wall. "It's posted." "Then you understand." "I understand what it says. I'm less certain it says what you think it says." Reg looked at him. "What I think," Clint said, in the quiet voice of someone who has completely thought something through, "is that a man who served 2 wars is sitting at a table in the country he served, and the only policy that should apply to him is whatever basic decency this place has left." He looked up at Reg with the Eastwood eyes, not threatening, not performing, simply present, with the full weight of someone who means every word and is not going anywhere. "He's eating here today," Clint said, "and I'd encourage you to think carefully about what history you want this diner to have." Reg stood there for a moment, then he nodded. Once, the compressed nod of a man making a decision he hasn't entirely made peace with, but is making anyway, and went back to the kitchen. Danny reappeared, refilled both cups without speaking. Walter looked at his refilled cup, then at Clint. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "I know," Clint said. "It'll follow you out of here. People talk." "That's fine." Walter was quiet for a moment, composing something he wanted to say correctly. "I've been in harder places than this diner," he said. "Places where the opposition had better weapons than a sign on a wall, and I was scared in those places." He looked at the table, then back at Clint. "I walked in here this morning and I wasn't scared, but I was tired." A pause. "I'm less tired now." They finished their breakfast. Clint paid for both, the simple, unremarked gesture of someone for whom the gesture required no announcement. Walter retrieved his service cap and put it on with the quiet ceremony of a man who earned it in places this diner could not imagine. They walked out together. The bell above the door rang twice. The 31 people in that diner carried what they had witnessed out into the Tuesday, into their cars, their homes, their dinner tables that night. The story of a young man from a television show and an old man from 2 wars who had breakfast together in a room organized around the idea that they shouldn't, and had done it quietly, as if it were simply the most obvious thing in the world. The Civil Rights Act was signed 2 years later, in 1964. Walter Hayes lived until 1989. His daughter, in an interview given many years after his death, said he had told the story of that Tuesday morning perhaps 100 times. Not as a story about celebrity, not as a story about being saved by a famous person, but as a story about a cup of coffee. "He always said the same thing," she recalled. "A young man sat down across from me and had breakfast like it was nothing, like it was the most natural thing in the world. And for 40 minutes, it was." Clint Eastwood never spoke publicly about that morning. Not in the interviews of his early career, not in the retrospectives that accumulated as he became something the culture returned to regularly to understand itself. The morning at Mel's was not in the official record, not with names attached and dates confirmed. It was in the other record, the one kept by the people in the room. Danny, who refilled the cups and did not speak. Reg, who nodded once and went back to the kitchen and told his own daughter about it years later, with a mixture of shame and something that had taken him a long time to identify as pride. The woman in the church hat, who stopped at the table and said thank you and meant it. Some things change because laws are passed. Some things change because someone marches or sits at a lunch counter or refuses to move to the back of a bus. And some things change one Tuesday morning at a time, one cup of coffee, one table, one young man who picked up his cup and walked across a room and sat down and said, in every way except words, this is how it should be, and I am going to act as if it already is. Clint Eastwood was 32 years old. The room was organized around a specific idea of who ate where and whose service to the country earned them a meal and whose didn't. He picked up his coffee and moved. That was all. That was everything.